He humiliated her in front of the entire office and fired her, calling it a hiring mistake. Only a few days later, he sees her again, but not in the same place. Now, her word will decide whether he stays with the company. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Write in the comments what city you're from. The elevator opened with a soft chime, releasing a few sharply dressed employees into the open-plan workspace of Revell and Hunt's headquarters. Nestled in the heart of Manhattan's business district, the building was a towering monolith of mirrored glass and polished steel, a symbol of power and prestige in a world that thrived on appearances. From the gleaming floors to the minimalist design of its offices, everything about Revell and Hunt projected excellence. But underneath the surface polish, something colder ran through the veins of the company, an unspoken hierarchy that went beyond titles and performance. Naomi Walker stepped out of the elevator quietly, her heels soundless on the marble floor. She wore a tailored navy blue blouse tucked into a charcoal gray skirt, her natural curls pulled back into a neat bun. She didn't dress to impress, she dressed to disappear. There was something precise in her movements, a deliberate economy of presence, as though she understood the weight of each glance she might attract and did everything possible to deflect it. Her desk was tucked into the corner of the Strategy Development Department, a department she had worked hard to join. It wasn't easy getting through the recruitment process. Revell and Hunt prided itself on only selecting the best, and the competition was brutal. Naomi's academic record had been spotless. She had graduated near the top of her class in business analytics and held 2 prestigious internships under her belt. But she knew that, for some, that would never be enough. Her name, her skin, the way she spoke, all of it formed the silent test she had to pass every day. Across the office, the sound of sharp footsteps echoed louder than necessary. Jonathan Marks had arrived. He didn't greet anyone. He never did. At 43, he held one of the most influential non-executive positions in the company, and he moved with the unconscious confidence of a man who had never needed to prove himself. His suit was always a crisp navy, his shirts white and perfectly pressed, and his shoes polished to a military shine. His gaze scanned the office, dismissive and predatory at once, as if he were constantly assessing who belonged and who didn't. He barely looked at Naomi as he passed her desk. He rarely did, except when there was something he could correct. "Walker," he said one day, stopping beside her without looking down, "try not to drown the next report in unnecessary adjectives. I want clarity, not poetry." Naomi looked up, blinking once. She hadn't used adjectives beyond what the report's framework required. "Understood," she said calmly, returning her gaze to the spreadsheet before her. He lingered a second too long before walking away, lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Naomi had dealt with men like Jonathan before. Men who believed in metrics and meritocracy, unless the results came from someone they didn't expect. She kept her head down, kept producing high-quality work, and refused to let his subtle barbs make their way under her skin. She believed, perhaps naively, that if she just did her job better than anyone else, she would eventually be recognized for it. Recognition did come in a way. During one of the weekly brainstorming meetings, the team had hit a wall while trying to innovate a new approach to brand positioning for a major international client. Naomi had listened quietly while the others went around in circles, dancing around outdated strategies and reheated ideas. Finally, she spoke. "What if we shift the demographic target entirely?" she said. "This brand is saturated with its current base. but we have data showing growth in Gen Z markets across urban platforms. We could pivot, move the entire conversation to digital culture, memes, music partnerships, reframe the brand as not just relevant, but native to that environment. The room fell quiet. For a moment, even Jonathan didn't speak. Then he blinked, looked at her, and said nothing. He moved the conversation along without acknowledging her contribution. The meeting ended shortly after. 3 days later, Jonathan presented the exact same idea to the executive board as part of his new strategy initiative. Naomi sat at the back of the room as he delivered it with confidence and charisma, attaching charts and metrics that she herself had pulled. No one in the room questioned the authorship. One junior associate glanced at Naomi and then looked quickly away. She remained composed, though her hands, hidden under the table, were clenched tight. She said nothing afterward. There was nothing to say. The theft of intellectual contribution wasn't new in corporate culture, but this one stung more deeply than usual. It wasn't just the erasure. It was the certainty in Jonathan's eyes that no one would question him, that she wouldn't dare fight back. But the real blow came a week later. It was a Monday morning, and the whole department had gathered for a quarterly performance review. The tension was high. One of their client portfolios had underperformed slightly, and rumors of internal restructuring were in the air. Jonathan stood at the head of the room, flanked by the director of operations and an HR observer. There was a tightness in his voice as he began speaking, and Naomi immediately felt something was wrong. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to address a lapse in quality that has become increasingly apparent in recent weeks. Specifically, I'm referring to the Q2 report for the Paragon account." He picked up a printed version of the document and held it in the air. "This report," he said slowly, "was riddled with analytical errors, faulty projections, duplicated figures, and conclusions that completely missed the mark." The room was silent. Jonathan turned and looked directly at Naomi. "This report," he said, "was produced under the supervision of Miss Naomi Walker." There was a collective intake of breath. Naomi sat very still. "That kind of sloppiness," Jonathan continued, "reflects not just on the individual, but on this entire department. And frankly, I'm tired of watching this team carry dead weight. So let me be clear. Effective immediately, Miss Walker's employment with Revell and Hunt is terminated." Someone gasped. A pen clattered to the floor. Naomi stood up slowly. Her expression was unreadable. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She gathered her notebook, placed it gently into her leather bag, and straightened her posture. Her eyes met Jonathan's. She held his gaze for several seconds, not with hate, but with something quieter, stronger. And then she turned and walked out. No one said a word. No one stood up. Only after the door had closed did someone murmur, "She didn't deserve that." In the hallway, Naomi walked calmly to the elevator. Her chest felt hollow, but her steps were firm. She had known this moment might come. Still, the cruelty of it, the deliberate spectacle, left a chill in her bones. As she stepped into the elevator and the doors closed, she allowed herself a single moment to breathe. She looked at her reflection in the mirror-lined walls. The woman staring back wasn't defeated. Her eyes were clear, her spine straight. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, but filled with steel. "I'll be back," she said softly, but not as a secretary. Somewhere behind her, Jonathan Marks leaned against the boardroom table, basking in the silence he had imposed on the room. He believed he had won, that he had made a point, but he had just made the most consequential mistake of his career. And the woman he thought he had erased was already on her way to rewrite the rules. The hours following Naomi's departure passed with an uneasy stillness. Though the office maintained its usual rhythm, calls being answered, emails flying back and forth, deadlines being met, there was a subtle difference in the air. It was in the glances exchanged near the break room, in the abrupt silences when someone almost brought up the incident but stopped just short, in the careful way employees avoided Jonathan's gaze as he moved through the floor like nothing had happened. No memo had gone out. No internal explanation had been provided. In official terms, Naomi had simply left the company. But everyone knew. Everyone had seen. Jonathan Marks, however, walked with the same poise as always. If he noticed the shift in energy, he gave no indication. His shoulders were squared, his expressions clipped, his voice steady as he led meetings and sent out directives. If anything, he seemed even more assertive than usual, as if he were proving something to himself. But late at night, when the offices had emptied and only the cleaning crew roamed the corridors with their carts and vacuum hums, he would remain behind. His office, a sleek corner chamber with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, became a silent cage of reflection. He never allowed himself to admit it aloud, but he kept replaying the way Naomi had looked at him in that final moment. Silent, proud, unbroken. There had been no pleading in her eyes, no apology, not even hatred. Just something like revelation. Like she had seen him fully for the first time, and he had finally realized he had never truly seen her at all. He told himself he had done what needed to be done. That report had been flawed. He had found errors, even if minor. But deep down, he knew it hadn't been about the report. He had been looking for a reason, a release. She had challenged him without ever raising her voice. Her presence alone, her quiet competence, had unsettled something in him he couldn't name. It had been easier to dismiss her than confront whatever it was she represented. It was easier to believe she didn't belong. The following week was critical. An enormous investment deal was underway with a multinational conglomerate headquartered in South Africa. The company, Aurelius Group, was known not only for its vast media holdings but also for its reclusive, enigmatic founder, a man rarely seen in public, with a reputation for pulling strings behind the scenes of major industry shifts. News of his interest in Revell and Hunt had caused a stir on Wall Street. Analysts speculated about acquisitions, takeovers, strategic realignments, but no one truly knew what he wanted, or who would be making the decisions. The leadership team at Revell and Hunt had spent months preparing for this moment. Jonathan, being one of the most senior department heads, was to be part of the closed-door welcoming committee. He had been anticipating this meeting with a sense of rising ambition. This was the kind of opportunity that could catapult a man like him into the highest tiers of corporate leadership. If the deal went through smoothly and he impressed the investors, he could find himself considered for a global role. It was within reach. He stood before the mirror that morning longer than usual, adjusting the knot of his tie with precise care. The suit he wore was his sharpest, a tailored charcoal with a subtle herringbone pattern. He looked the part of a man in control, a man prepared to meet power face to face. The boardroom had been transformed for the occasion, not ostentatiously, but with polished restraint. Soft lighting, minimalist floral arrangements, branded water bottles and notepads lined the table. Executives waited in stiff chairs, rehearsing their talking points silently. The atmosphere was one of alert anticipation. When the doors finally opened, every head turned. First came the founder of Aurelius Group. He was tall, elegant in movement, dressed in a custom suit of dark olive wool. His presence filled the room not with volume but with density. He was a man who carried silence like armor. His hair was silver, his eyes deep-set and sharp, scanning the room not for weaknesses but for truth. But it was the person who entered just behind him who drew a sharp breath from Jonathan. She walked with quiet authority, her posture unyielding, her gaze straight ahead. She wore a dove-gray suit that balanced power and grace, and her natural hair was styled in a smooth halo, framing her face like a crown. Naomi. Jonathan's stomach flipped in a way he hadn't felt since childhood. She didn't glance at him as she took her seat beside the man, aligning her folder neatly in front of her. Her presence was not an accessory to the meeting. It was central to it. There was something different in her now, something grounded. She looked like someone who had always belonged in this room and knew it. The introductions began. One by one, the executives presented themselves. When the chairman of Revell and Hunt introduced Jonathan, he stood stiffly. His voice caught for just a second before he recovered. "A pleasure," he said, looking toward the founder, and then, against all his instincts, toward Naomi. Only then did she meet his eyes. There was no smile, no trace of emotion. She looked at him the way one might regard a stranger on a passing train, observant, noting, unmoved. "My daughter, Naomi Miller," the founder said, his voice calm but commanding. "She'll be leading this investment review." A wave of shock passed through the room. Not visibly. These were professionals. But Jonathan felt it in the way someone's hand jerked toward a pen, the way another man shifted slightly in his seat. It was a disruption, a recalibration. Everyone was adjusting their mental frameworks. Jonathan, however, was collapsing inside. His mind reeled. Miller. Naomi Miller. He had never known her full name. He had never cared to ask. She had simply been Walker, the quiet analyst, the brown-skinned girl who never challenged him out loud. And now she was the voice of the deal, the face of the investor, the one person in the room with the authority to unmake him. She did not mention the past. She did not reference the termination. She simply conducted herself with the poise of someone who had seen worse and overcome it. Throughout the meeting, she asked direct, insightful questions. She listened intently. She deferred to her father only when protocol required it. Her command of the material was flawless. Jonathan could barely hear the rest of the presentations. His vision tunneled, his focus fraying with each passing second. He felt the sweat collect beneath his collar, the edge of his cuff digging into his wrist. The meeting ended after 2 hours. The room rose. Hands were shaken. Smiles were exchanged. Naomi offered polite nods, said little, and moved with her father toward the exit. As they passed Jonathan's seat, she paused for the briefest moment. He rose, unsure what to say, whether to apologize, to grovel, to pretend, but she said nothing. Just as she reached the door, she looked back at him, not with triumph, not with vengeance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had returned, not to settle scores, but to make her presence undeniable. "You never asked for my full name," she said softly. "Did you?" And then she was gone. Jonathan remained in the room long after everyone else had left. The chairs sat empty. The filtered light through the high windows cast shadows that moved like time itself. He sat heavily in his chair, feeling the weight of something irreversible settle onto his shoulders. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be powerless. Not because she had humiliated him. She hadn't. Not because she had threatened him. She didn't need to. It was because she had said nothing, and in that silence she had held a mirror to him, one he could no longer avoid. and in that reflection he saw what he had always refused to admit. He had dismissed her. He had underestimated her. And now, for the first time, he was terrified that the future no longer included a place for the man he had allowed himself to become. The week following Naomi Miller's return was one of quiet upheaval. On the surface, the company kept its shape. Meetings were held, emails exchanged, deadlines met, but something fundamental had shifted in the foundation. Naomi's presence had rippled through the halls like a gust of cold wind in a sealed room. Everyone had felt it, though no one dared to speak about it aloud. They had seen her walk in beside the investor whose capital would soon dictate the direction of Revell and Hunt, and they had seen Jonathan Marks sit pale and silent in his chair while she reviewed his work without once acknowledging the history between them. It hadn't been a confrontation. It hadn't needed to be. Jonathan tried to recover his footing. He told himself the moment had passed, that he could realign, recenter, resume. But deep inside, something had cracked. He felt it during conference calls when his voice faltered ever so slightly. He felt it during presentations when he caught others glancing at Naomi instead of him. He told himself it was paranoia. He told himself she was simply enjoying a moment of vindication and that it would pass. But he knew. Whatever power he'd once wielded, whatever control he thought he had, she had changed the terrain simply by standing there. Then came the firestorm. It began innocuously. A blog post on a popular finance gossip site, anonymous under 800 words, but what it lacked in length it made up for in implication. It detailed the firing of a young black woman by a senior executive at Revell and Hunt, citing unnamed sources that claimed racial bias, intimidation, and the deliberate sabotage of her professional contributions. It referenced internal reports, hinted at photographs, and concluded with a single damning question. Is the future of Revell and Hunt being shaped by those who silence what they cannot control? Within hours, the post had gone viral. By morning, mainstream outlets had picked it up. Talk shows debated it. Social media exploded with outrage, commentary, and speculation. Hashtags emerged, memes, parodies. Public opinion began to crystallize around a name now whispered through the corridors with unease. Jonathan Marks. The company attempted containment. A statement was issued, measured, non-committal, emphasizing a commitment to diversity and inclusion. But the statement fell flat. Screenshots of internal emails were leaked. Photos from the performance review circulated, blurred and grainy, but unmistakable. The narrative had already escaped their control. Inside the company, fear and silence ruled. Colleagues avoided Jonathan's gaze. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Even his longtime allies in senior management kept their distance. In board meetings, his once commanding presence was now ghost-like. His opinions met with polite nods and redirected eyes. Jonathan stopped sleeping. He reread the article a dozen times, searching for inaccuracies, loopholes, something to refute. He found none. The worst part wasn't that it was exaggerated, it was that it wasn't. Every word, however stylized for dramatic effect, was rooted in a truth he could no longer deny. He emailed Naomi. No response. He texted her a cautious, dry message. Silence. He called once, late at night, just to hear the click of the automated message. The user is unavailable to take your call. She had vanished behind a wall of distance so complete it chilled him more than any scream could have. One morning, he arrived to find a letter from the Crisis Ethics Committee on his desk, requesting his presence for a private review. The room was stark when he entered. 3 chairs, a table, 2 committee members whose faces were blank masks of professionalism. They didn't accuse him. They didn't threaten. They simply asked questions about his department's turnover rate, about performance discrepancies, about his decision to terminate Naomi. He answered them all, carefully, mechanically, but the hollowness in his voice betrayed him. They nodded, took notes, thanked him, and dismissed him with the vague promise of further internal assessment. The humiliation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He was being erased. Reputation was currency in this world, and his was dissolving. But the most unexpected part was still to come. It was a cold Thursday afternoon when Naomi walked into his office without knocking. Jonathan looked up, startled, half rising from his chair. His first instinct was to speak, to apologize, to explain, to beg for a conversation he didn't deserve. But something in her eyes stopped him. She looked different, more resolute. She carried herself with quiet strength, not the kind bred from victory, but the kind earned in fire. She placed a small black flash drive on his desk. "This," she said, "is a recording." He stared at it, unmoving. "A meeting between 2 Zeta Capital executives," she continued, "discussing how to manufacture a scandal around you, to tank your reputation, drive your influence down before the merger. You weren't the only target. They aimed at the company, at my father's interest." Jonathan said nothing. His throat was tight. "I got it through a friend in cybersecurity. It's real. It proves what they did." He finally found his voice. "Why are you giving this to me?" She looked at him then, and her expression held no pity, no warmth, but also no hatred. "Because I believe in justice," she said. "Not for you, but for the truth." She turned to leave. "Naomi," he started, but her hand had already touched the door. She didn't look back. "Don't say my name like you ever knew who I was." The door clicked softly behind her. Jonathan remained seated, staring at the flash drive. He didn't touch it, not immediately. It sat there, small and unassuming, yet impossibly heavy. Proof, salvation, but more than that, judgment. He had built a career on calculated power, on reading people, controlling narratives, and yet he had missed her entirely. Not just her name or her position. He had missed her humanity. Now she had returned not with vengeance, but with integrity. She had chosen not to bury him, though she could have. She had chosen not to lie, though the world already had. That night, Jonathan didn't go home. He stayed in the office, lights dim, staring out at the glittering skyline as the city pulsed beneath him. Once it had felt like a kingdom. Now it felt like glass underfoot. He replayed the timeline of their interaction in his mind. Every meeting, every report, every moment he had brushed her aside, failed to listen, failed to see. The truth of it hollowed him out more than any punishment ever could. He had destroyed her career without a second thought, and she had preserved his without blinking. At dawn, he picked up his phone and dialed William Miller. "I want to hold a press conference," he said. There was a pause. "I'm not asking for your help," Jonathan added quietly. "I just want her to be there." Miller didn't answer immediately. "If she shows up," he said finally, "it'll be because she chooses to. No one forces her." That afternoon, the auditorium at Revell and Hunt's headquarters was filled to capacity. Reporters lined the back. Employees watched via live stream. Executives sat in the front row, expressionless, awaiting either a resignation or a miracle. Jonathan stepped onto the stage without notes, without an earpiece. He wore no tie, just a white shirt rolled at the sleeves. He looked older, tired, but clearer than he had in years. "Good afternoon," he began. He paused, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of it land. "I'm not here today to deny the stories you've heard," he said, "nor am I here to ask for forgiveness." He inhaled slowly. "I used to think that being right was enough, that if the numbers added up, if the outcomes were profitable, then the means didn't matter, that people were parts in a machine, and if a piece didn't fit, you replaced it." He looked out across the room. "But then, someone showed me what it looks like when dignity is met with silence, when humanity is ignored, when power is used not to protect, but to suppress." He stepped forward, voice steady now. "I wronged Naomi Miller. I dismissed her ideas. I questioned her presence. I took her work and claimed it, and when I felt threatened by her brilliance, I removed her." He bowed his head. "I was wrong." A hush fell over the room. He didn't expect applause. He didn't want it. From the back row a figure stood. Naomi. Dressed simply, her expression unreadable. Jonathan met her gaze. "I'm not asking to be trusted again," he said. "I just hope I can learn what it means to listen, not to reply, but to understand." He reached into his pocket and placed the flash drive on the podium. Then he turned, walked off the stage, and exited through the same door she had once walked through months ago. This time, it was he who left in silence. 3 weeks passed. The storm, once consuming, began to quiet. The headlines faded, the articles moved on to newer scandals, and the public's attention shifted. The digital wildfire that had nearly consumed Revell and Hunt died down to a few embers glowing in forgotten comment sections. The company's shares slowly recovered, not entirely, but enough to reassure investors. Most would remember the incident as just another brief tremor in the ever-unstable terrain of corporate life, but inside the company, within its walls and corridors, the echo remained. Jonathan Marks still came to work, though less often, and when he did, his steps were softer, slower. He had become a quieter figure, no longer the force that commanded rooms. He moved like someone navigating unfamiliar ground, pausing often, observing people he once overlooked. There was no sudden transformation, no instant redemption. Just a man learning how little he had known of the world he had ruled for so long. Naomi, now officially installed as the strategic representative of Aurelius Group, occupied the top floor in an office once reserved for the most senior visiting executives. No one questioned her presence anymore. The same people who once dismissed her now deferred to her, though she neither demanded obedience nor invited closeness. She was not vindictive, she was exacting. She made decisions with clarity and precision, never raising her voice, never needing to. Her authority came from something deeper than position. It came from having walked through fire and never having lost her core. The announcement of her appointment had sent its own tremors through the company. When William Miller declared her the sole custodian of the Aurelius stake in Revell and Hunt, the news was not delivered with ceremony, but with surgical impact. The board had no choice but to approve. Investors couldn't protest. Naomi was no longer someone you tried to impress. She was someone you answered to. On the day of the announcement, she took the stage in a press room filled with analysts, partners, and press. She stood before the microphone in a black suit tailored to elegance and restraint. Her posture was perfect, her hands still, her expression calm. She didn't look to the cameras. She looked into the room, into the eyes of those who had watched her fall. "When you're treated unfairly," she said, "you have two choices, stay silent or stand up." She paused long enough for the silence to deepen. "Today, I choose to stand up, not for revenge, but for change." The audience sat still. not out of discomfort, but out of understanding. "I'm not here to dismantle anyone," she continued. "I'm here to remind those who assign value based on titles and appearances that the world has moved on." Some glanced at Jonathan in the front row. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He sat still, his face calm, his eyes tired. But unlike before, he was listening. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Naomi said. "Forgiveness means refusing to let pain decide your choices." She turned her gaze toward him then. Not soft, not hard, measured, like a verdict not of punishment, but of truth. "I return not as someone wounded," she said, "but as someone who knows her worth and will never again allow anyone to diminish it." She stepped down without further words. The applause began slowly, hesitantly, then built in quiet waves. It wasn't celebration. It was respect. Jonathan did not clap. He didn't rise. He didn't speak. But he watched her walk past him with the grace of someone who had won not through force, but through refusal to bend. As she passed, her shoulder brushing his, she tilted her head slightly. "This time," she said softly, "you don't need to apologize. Just don't repeat it." And then she moved on without looking back. The following week, the company returned to a rhythm that resembled normalcy, though the definition of that word had changed for many. Naomi became a part of the structure not by imposition, but by presence. She did not fire anyone. She did not demand public loyalty. Her standards were high, her expectations clear. She held herself to the same level she asked of others. Jonathan continued his work from a smaller office on the 20th floor. The corner office had been reassigned. He didn't protest. He hadn't expected to keep it. He kept his head down, stayed out of sight, and focused on the few projects still under his domain. Rumors swirled about his eventual departure, but he neither confirmed nor denied them. He came in early, left late, and said little. Late one Friday, well after most of the building had emptied, a knock sounded on the glass wall of Naomi's office. She looked up. Jonathan stood there, not in a suit, but in a simple shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He held a brown paper bag in his hand. She said nothing as he entered. He walked slowly, placing the bag on the edge of her desk with careful precision. "Peppermint tea and flaxseed cookies," he said. "I remembered you mentioned them once, after a bad day." She studied him for a long moment. There was no visible reaction. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said quietly. If you'd allow it, I'd like to start over, from the beginning." She didn't reply immediately. She rose from her chair, walked to the edge of the room, and looked out over the city. The skyline shimmered in the distance, 1,000 stories unfolding in light. After a long silence, she turned back to him. "From the beginning," she echoed. Her voice was calm, almost detached, like she was weighing not his words, but their implications. She walked to her desk, opened the bag, and took out the tea and the cookies. She held them in her hands for a moment, then looked at him not with forgiveness, not with animosity, with something quieter, something that said, "I see you. I haven't forgotten, but I'm willing to wait and see." "Then tell me," she said finally, her tone cool and even, "which position are you applying for?" Jonathan blinked. There was a pause, and then, slowly, a faint smile touched his lips, not of victory, but of understanding, of humility. He didn't answer. He knew he didn't need to. Not yet. Naomi stepped towards the door, tea in one hand, cookies in the other. As she passed him, she paused just long enough for her voice to reach him like a final note. "This time, learn to listen," she said, not to reply, but to understand. And then she was gone. The office remained still in her absence. Jonathan stood alone in the soft hum of electronics and distant traffic, the scent of peppermint slowly unfolding in the air. He didn't move for a long time. He simply stood, breathing it in. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know whether he would stay or leave, succeed or fade. But for the first time in his career, he understood something fundamental. Not every ending is a loss. Some endings are simply the space where something more honest begins. And sometimes the greatest gift you can receive isn't forgiveness. It's a chance to earn what comes next. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video, and don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.